I'm Letty Cottin Pogrebin, and I heard echoes of my own experience throughout Charlotte's talk. We have overlapped over the years, and now I understand why. In a sense, I left Judaism for a feminist reason, and I returned because the women's movement made reconnection to Judaism possible. The way I describe my journey really is embodied in my book title, Deborah, Golda, and Me, because I think about my spiritual journey as a kind of a Deborah scenario, Deborah from the Book of Judges. It happens that Deborah was my Haftarah, my reading from the prophets, from the Book of Judges, when I was bat mitzvah at the age of 13 in 1952. I was one of the first girls to be bat mitzvah in conservative Judaism. The Golda part of my journey is the kind of political arc that involves coming to terms with being a Jew in the secular world, and the Me is the synthesis. So I will kind of take you through all three of those journeys in 20 minutes. I see themes in my life that have to do with the struggle to reconcile contradictions, to braid together dualities and trialities, if there's such a word. I've confronted so many forced choices in my life. And I guess the original one had to do with my parents. When I think of forced choices, I think of being asked to choose between Judaism and feminism, being asked to choose between activism and politics and a more spiritual, contemplative life as a writer, perhaps. But the original dichotomy was between my mother and father. And I think for many of us, we can kind of locate our concepts of what our choices were in our parents. My mother was an immigrant, arrived here in poverty from Hungary, from a small shtetl, a little village, driven away by bigotry and discrimination and fear for their lives. My mother's Judaism was uneducated because girls were not educated in the early years of the 20th century. And so it was simple. It was what we call Hamish. It was home-based. It was warm. It was family-oriented. But it was more than a matter of setting a beautiful Shabbat table. My mother was a designer. She worked her way up from being a sewing machine operator to being a designer for Hattie Carnegie. And she had that aesthetic, and she brought it to her Judaism because she didn't have enough of the substance to bring to her Judaism. She would decorate the house for holidays. She would create Queen Esther on Purim out of celery and parsley, and she would paint the mirror in the dining room so that I could see the entire Maccabean revolt while eating my grapefruit. My mother kept kosher, except I was fed something called lamb chops on paper, which I later discovered was called the meat that was in the BLT in my Christian friends' households. And the reason I was given bacon, even though I lived in a Jewish household, it was put on a paper plate, the windows were opened, a special pot was kept under the sink, was because my mother saw that all my Christian friends were healthier looking than I was, a very skinny and wan child, and she, as an immigrant, figured out that this must be the American way to get healthy. My mother thought, in her very pure way, because I did ask her when I found out that the BLT and the lamb chops on paper were the exact same thing, my mother explained that I had to be healthy. It was more important that Jewish children survive because Jewish children were dying every day in my childhood during the Second World War and the Holocaust. And it was more important that I survive and God would understand. And that was my mother's relationship to God, since it wasn't based on text and it wasn't based on knowledge of synagogue ritual. My mother had a very personal relationship with God, which she generally acted out by negating the evil eye, by negating the devil. She could figure out what you did to ward off the devil and that way get closer to God. I think that was her logic. And how she did that was kind of remaining on speaking terms with the evil eye, figuring out what it was that would attract The evil eye, envy, anything to do with death, brought the devil, and you had to avoid it, you had to ward it off. So there was a red ribbon on the bassinet. You were not allowed to take a picture of a pregnant woman because that would anticipate God's will and give the devil room. You had to have bread and salt in a new house before you could sleep there. When I menstruated, I was slapped across the face, and my mother said something in Yiddish, and I said, "What's going on here?" I had certainly never been hit, and my mother said, "I just asked God that this be the worst pain you ever feel as a woman, that slap." Of course, it didn't work out that way. But her intentions were so good. My mother would not she wouldn't sew anything while I was in it without me chewing on a thread. Why? I always asked why, and she said because the only thing that you should be sewn into is your shroud, and when your teeth are moving, the devil knows you're alive. You're not in your shroud. Couldn't have the moon shining in on me because the moon should only shine on your grave. The devil might think that you are already dead and come and take you. All of this was her way of ordering the universe because she had no other tools. But the respect for God was communicated to me, the beauty of Jewish ritual, the way that holidays were enlivened and fleshed out in our life, in our household, was really the kind of the definition of Judaism for me, at a deep kind of heart level. My father was a very different story. My father was born in America because his mother was pregnant on the boat and waited to deliver him till she got here, to his everlasting delight. He lorded it over my mother in the sense that he was a Connecticut Yankee. My father did not have to drop out of school as my mother did. They were each one of 7 children. My father was a lawyer who was also a Talmud scholar and a Baal Koreh. He was a reader of Torah who could open the scrolls at any point and read the Torah with the proper cantillation without the vowels, which are not written in the Torah. My father tutored bar mitzvah boys for $150 each in the 20s. He was my tutor for my bat mitzvah. Not only was that important to me because he was an excellent teacher, but because it allowed me to spend time with my father, who was very busy being a big macher, a big shot in the Jewish community, but was not very present in my life unless I attracted his intellectual attention. So in terms of that dichotomy, I had here the emotional mother and the highly rational father. My father made sure that I went to Hebrew school, not just Hebrew school, but Hebrew high school. I went to the yeshiva of Central Queens, and I was bat mitzvah under his tutelage. I probably would have sort of trod the balance between the two of them and their very different influences had my mother not died in 1955 when I was 15. And the first night when we were sitting Shiva, that's the first 7 days after the death, and you have a memorial service that requires a prayer for public prayer where you say the Kaddish, the memorial prayer. And in 1955, you needed 10 Jews for a Kaddish and for a minyan, for a quorum, and 10 Jews meant 10 men, 10 male Jews. And there was a house full of people, but only 9 real Jews, only 9 men in the room. So my father picked up the phone and called our synagogue, of which he was president of pretty much everything you could be the president of in the Jewish community at the time. And he summoned a 10th man to make a minyan to allow us to proceed. And I will never forget the 10th man came and he held the little Yizkor book upside down. He couldn't read Hebrew. I had been bat mitzvah. I was a very well educated and quite pious little girl. I went to synagogue every Shabbat. Very often sat up on the bima with my father during the years when he was president or when he read from the Torah. And my connection to Judaism was very deep and very visceral, but I was told I didn't count. And if I didn't count, I wasn't going to count myself in. So I left Judaism at 15. I left in the sense of the belonging that we in the Jewish community so relish, the notion of What do you belong to? I mean, we mean by that what synagogue, what JCC, what organization, where does our tzedakah go, our charitable dollars, our giving, our gemilut chesed, our acts of loving kindness. Where do we place ourselves in the spectrum? I left in that sense and remained true only to my mother's Judaism. I didn't let the moon shine on my children. I honored her memory through her superstitions and through her acts of beautifying Jewish ritual and the Shabbat. So it was an entirely home-based Judaism. For 15 years, I married, I had children. I did not send my children to Hebrew school. I did not have my daughter's bat mitzvah or my son bar mitzvah. I married a Jewish man who was a radical lefty who couldn't care less about religion, so if I didn't do it, it didn't get done. And it didn't get done. In 1970, in our summer community on Fire Island, a group of Jewish people, it was a very, very nascent Jewish community there. It had been a restricted community, and there were just a few Jewish families who had started coming in, and we all said, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to buy a ticket and go into the city and go to High Holy Day services? Because none of us were affiliated. And yet, we were all once-a-year Jews, as so many are, where you want to be in community for that hallowed moment of the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur period. So we decided we would have a service. And we were organizing the service for High Holy Days, and we're going to get the sacramental wine, and we're going to borrow Machzorim, the High Holy Day prayer books, and you know, the store is going to donate honey cake for the break fast after Yom Kippur, and all of that is all arranged, and one of the men said, who's going to run the service? And although all those men had been bar mitzvah, as is typical in so many lives, they hadn't been in synagogue in a kind of ongoing sense, and nobody could do it. And I, who grew up with these melodies in my brain and in my cells, volunteered. That was 1970. That was before Ms. Magazine. It was before the ordination of any woman in Reform Judaism or Reconstructionist, although there were bat mitzvahs in Reconstructionist Judaism early on. None of the other advances we've all witnessed had happened yet. However, necessity is, as we know, the mother of invention, and there was no one else. It's also the mother of revolution. There was no one else to do it, and I volunteered, and I said, I'll do it. And I took a machzor and I kind of marked it with Post-its as to how to create like an hour-and-a-half service for what I lived through on Yom Kippur as like a 14-hour service, an all-day service. I sort of took the parts that I felt you had to say in order to get in touch with the authentic spirit of the day and the meaning of the day. And I led the service. And that began my search for a way to reconnect, because I had said to God that day, if you don't want me to do this, send me a message. And as the daughter of a superstitious mother, I usually get those messages. I truly do. But nothing happened. In fact, I chanted the Kol Nidre, and I had a sense of absolutely doing the right thing. As my mother would have put it about bacon, God understood. So that was 1970, and what ensued after that was a journey back to Judaism through feminism, because changes were happening in the Jewish world that allowed me to reconnect. I looked for a synagogue to belong to. That was very hard, because as soon as Sally Prysand was ordained as the first Reform rabbi, I joined her synagogue, which was Stephen Wise, but I didn't connect to the texture. There wasn't enough Hebrew. There wasn't enough singing. It was a choir. There was an organ. It wasn't the Judaism I'd grown up with, and so I didn't really feel comfortable there. It took until 1985 when conservative Judaism ordained women, and then I was able to find a wonderful synagogue called B'nai Jeshurun, where activist rabbis came up from Argentina, who had been the rabbis of the disappeared and Jacobo Timmerman, were the rabbis there, and allowed me to feel both politically and spiritually at home. During those years, I, however, was able to connect through feminism, because I was able to link up with a group of like-minded women. who had the same feelings I did and the same training I did and the same rage I did. And we created the Feminist Seder, the first Feminist Seder, which has been ongoing since 1976. We met in Rosh Chodesh groups, which is a first of the month that has kind of transmuted itself into Jewish women's consciousness raising and study. We did Tashlich services, which is when you cast your bread upon the waters, and kind of expiate your sins in a metaphoric way, but it's a wonderful feeling. We did it as women on the Hudson River. All of that sustained me through the years when I was not belonging. The golden part of my journey in the next 4 minutes, which is my secular journey. I thought, who needs a Jewish identity in the secular world? I don't. I have my religion, and that's feminism. I was a founder of Ms. Magazine. I came from Brandeis University, which was a Jewish place. I'd never experienced anti-Semitism. I worked in publishing where there were lots of Jews. New York closes down, the parking rules and everything on high holy days. I felt completely at home. Who needed to wear the label of a Jew? I learned otherwise in Mexico City at the International Women's Conference, UN Women's Conference in Mexico City, when the conference was hijacked, and Zionism is racism was the most important thing that came out of a women's conference. It was hijacked by organized governments who had an agenda vis-a-vis Israel. Now, we've come a long way. I could say a lot about Israel. I'm only going to say that, in my view, the experience of Mexico City and Copenhagen in 1980, the vitriol, the rage, the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic vituperation that was experienced by Jewish women, not because of Israel, but because we were Jews. The words were, Hitler didn't finish the job. The words were too painful to revisit, quite frankly. And I woke up and said, I'm the one who's dichotomizing. I'm trying to keep my Jewish self and my feminist self separate. I can't do that. I'm both. I have to present myself in the world on behalf of both communities. Sometimes the seesaw moves in one direction if I feel the female in me and in society is most threatened, and sometimes it moves in the other when I feel the Jew is the most imperiled. I wrote a piece that was the longest piece ever published in Ms. in 1982 called Anti-Semitism in the Women's Movement, which came after a year of research because I didn't want to believe that it was happening here. I thought, this is a function of international politics. This isn't real. This couldn't be happening in American feminism. And I actually researched and documented the ways in which it was happening. The ways in which Jewish women's historical experience in this country was eclipsed by the experience of every other ethnic group, and it was somehow or other not legitimate to claim that our experience might be unique and might have a role in assessing the experience of American women in general. The experience of having conferences happen on Shabbat that made it impossible for observant Jewish women to attend. Defacement of posters that were advertising Jewish women's caucuses on campus. Jap bashing on campus. All kinds of evidence that I marshaled and in this article kind of went public as a Jew. And since 1982, my writing has attempted to integrate my perceptions and sensibilities in the fullest range of who I am. To end, let me say that the me in the title of my book, Deborah Golda and Me, is an attempt at synthesis, at the weaving together of supposed opposites. And the meaning and impetus for this conference absolutely speaks to my gut soul experience in the world in terms of my religious and spiritual self and my secular feminist self. I try to live with a feminist head and a Jewish heart. For me, that has a great deal of meaning. I try to absolutely live in my everyday life the commandment to repair the world, to finish the act of creation that God did not. I do it through my work, not just in the Jewish world or the feminist world per se, but in dialogue and intergroup dialogue, Jewish-Palestinian dialogue, which I've been in for many years, and Black-Jewish dialogue in particular. So let me close with a an image. In the 1970s, when we had conferences, it seemed 3 times a month on various subjects, and this one was on the issue of women and identity. All around the room, the facilitator, that's kind of California speak for the chair of the conference, the facilitator had put up little placards that said woman, American, Jew, lesbian, black, Hispanic, and so on, all around the room. And you could stand under whatever placard seemed to speak to you. The facilitator said, don't think, don't figure this out. Just go to the one that speaks to your soul. In 1972, I would so easily have just gone beeline to the word that said, the placard that said woman. In 1982, after assessing anti-Semitism in the women's movement, I would have stood under the word Jew. And today I refuse to be asked to choose. Thank you.